Hey everybody. Hello, my name is Claire Malcolmson. I'm the Executive Director of the Rescue Lakesimko Coalition. We are a charity looking at the entire watershed around Lake Simcoe and advocating for good decisions to be made to help protect its health. We started in 2003. We now have 26 member groups around the Lake Simcoe watershed. The big focus of our work this year is the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan review. So that's quite a lot of the content I'll be talking about today. This is a map of the Lake Simcoe watershed. If you're not familiar with it, Barrie is here, and Orillia, and Newmarket, Aurora, and Bradford are all down here. So there are quite a lot of big cities, big towns. And it goes as far southeast as Uxbridge down in the bottom right corner of your screen. One of the things that makes Lake Simcoe stressed is that it's really close to the GTA. It's an hour north of Toronto. There were already 500,000 people that are living in the watershed now, and growth pressures are really big, in part due to the proximity of the GTA. So this is a shot of the Bradford bypass, and you can see Cook's Bay right back here. That's the water body that you see. That's the south end of Lake Simcoe. So you can see that this is hardly an urban area where the proposed highway would go. So this is, forests and wetlands and farmland. This is the northern extension of the Holland Marsh. Okay, so here we are in 2008. On the steps of Queen's Park, celebrating the passage of the Lake Simcoe Protection Act. Now, we have the Lake Simcoe Protection Act because the Rescue Lake Simcoe Coalition started a campaign involving environmental defense in Ontario nature with lots of citizen support and input to get special protection for Lake Simcoe. One, because it was excluded from the Greenbelt plan on the west side and the Simcoe County side. And two, because the lake has some really unique pressures and stresses. Actually, they're not really unique. They do apply to most water bodies in Southern Ontario. But Lake Simcoe is special, and Lake Simcoe needs the protections that it now has under the Lake Simcoe Protection Act and Plan. Those pieces of legislation, they address the major stresses affecting Lake Simcoe, and those are phosphorus pollution, climate change, loss of natural heritage and the need to protect natural heritage, invasive species, and the impacts of development. Those are all handled by the Lake Simcoe Protection Act and Plan. But the Act and Plan alone will not save the lake. So we're talking about the influence of a number of other decisions this year that are all weighing on Lake Simcoe. But I'm going to be talking about the backdrop of the Lake Simcoe Protection Act and Plan and what they tell us need to be done to protect the health of the lake. So what was strengthened under the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan? Here's a list. Some of my favorites are natural heritage and hydrologic feature or water feature protection and setbacks for development, mandatory septic inspection program, protection of smaller wetlands, caps on sewage treatment plants, phosphorus that were more aggressive than what was in place prior, and improved guidelines for stormwater management. Some of the highlights. There's also a phosphorus loading target. So this here is the target, this dotted red line. So the target for phosphorus loading is around 44 tons per year by 2045. So how are we doing on phosphorus loading? Well, we're really nowhere near that target. We are now double the target on a 10-year average basis. So clearly, lots more work has to be done to bring down phosphorus loads. That's important because when excess phosphorus and nitrogen, these are nutrients, when they get into the water, then they help promote weed and algae growth. And when those weeds and algae die and decompose, that process consumes oxygen from the water. And that is particularly challenging for the cold water fish that need oxygen at a certain depth, at a certain time of year. in the lake. And that is one of the reasons why, the target is what it is for phosphorus loads. It's really all around what the cold water fish species in the lake need. Having a number of scientists involved in the creation of this legislation analyzed what the fish need and what an appropriate phosphorus load would look like in order to achieve that dissolved oxygen level. What we're seeing now here is a real interaction between climate change impacts and phosphorus loads. So the yellow dots and the line that connects those are the flow volume. So that represents, the amount of water that's rushing through streams and rivers on their way to Lake Simcoe. Those flows have really been increasing with climate change as predicted and as projected, with an increase in serious precipitation events or significant precipitation events. So when there's a lot of water flowing through those streams, it picks up dirt and sediment, and there's of course dirt and sediment flowing off the land and rushing into those streams too. End of the day, that puts a lot more phosphorus into the lake. So it's really important that we manage climate change impacts and deal with remediating streams in order to help protect and in order to help reduce phosphorus loads. The other thing that this slide tells us is that we do have a real problem in the Lakesimko watershed with personal vehicle use and greenhouse gas emissions. Currently, 54% of greenhouse gas emissions, in 2016, were related to vehicles. And the Conservation Authority says with a business as usual scenario where population growth proceeds as projected and no specific action is taken on emissions reduction, there is a predicted increase of 57% in net emissions from the 2016 baseline to 2041. So it's important to point this out because this is really because we are developing in a sprawling way where everybody needs a car or more than one car per household in order to be able to access the things that people access in their communities. So this pattern of development is very profitable for the developers, and that's why it is being perpetuated, but it's really bad for the environment, and it's not good for people's health, and it's really not good for communities, and it contributes to climate change. So we need to point this out. This is an unsustainable development pattern, and it's contributing to worsening conditions at Lake Simcoe. The other piece of Lake Simcoe's health that our organization is really focused on is the protection of natural heritage. So we analyzed how well protected natural heritage is in the Lake Simcoe watershed. So what you see in this slide is a representation of, in dark green, the areas that are best protected by provincial policy. Those are significant forests, these core areas of the Oak Ridges Moraine down here in the south end, and provincially significant wetlands. So ironically, it's in this area where the Bradford bypass is proposed to cross over the east and west Holland River. These are areas that are supposed to be very well protected in the Lake Simcoe watershed. We have a lot of natural heritage in the Lake Simcoe watershed, and we definitely have an opportunity to better connect those protected areas and create a really good, robust natural heritage system that would be in line with the target of the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan, which is 40% high quality natural cover in the watershed. We're not there yet, and we still have more to do. So the context that we're really talking about here today is that there are multiple stresses occurring simultaneously that all affect Lake Simcoe, and potentially all of these decisions could be made this year. And we want to make very clear to decision makers and the interested and concerned public that if all of this goes ahead, we are in big trouble. So the Lake Simcoe Protection Plan review has been happening early 2021. The public consultation period is over, but municipalities are still making comments, and the province has not made any decisions. There's also pressure on sewage treatment plants going into Lake Simcoe. The Upper York sewage system is one that we're really concerned about. That decision is pending, and York Region and Durham Region are both advocating that it go into Lake Simcoe, which we find quite worrying. Topic for another day. The Orbit MZO proposal in Innisfil proposes 150,000 people over a generation near the shores of Lake Simcoe, and an MZO we think is not appropriate for something of that scale. It does not represent smart growth. And then finally, we have the growth plan. So the growth plan now requires municipalities to plan for sprawling growth to 2051. It's not the tighter density that we've been seeing over the last 10 to 15 years. It is much more sprawling. There are negative impacts to the atmosphere that I just described, but also we know that development has a negative impact on the lake. So when the province was putting together the Lakesimko phosphorus reduction strategy, they analyzed the impact of development. And for the period of 2016 to 2031, they estimated that that development would add 9 to 15 tons of phosphorus per year to Lakesimko. Remember, we're trying to bring loads down, cut them in half. So if you take that same amount and apply it to the period that's coming up, a conservative estimate is that the growth that has been ordered by the province, that the province has ordered that municipalities plan to accommodate that much growth around Lakesimko, that's going to have a negative impact on the lake too. So one thing actually I should mention before I move on is that the development policies in the Lakesimko Protection Plan are actually very helpful, and they do limit the impact of growth. And it's really critical that those policies remain strong and in place, and probably strengthened in the review of the Lakesimko Protection Plan to mitigate this impact that we know is coming. So now I'm going to talk a little bit about what we know about what it takes to protect Lakesimko. So the Lakesimko Science Committee, Lakesimko Stakeholder Advisory Committee, and a whole lot of provincial staff from multiple ministries, stakeholders from the development sector, tourism, recreation, fishing, Aboriginal, municipal, myself, groups like the Rescue Lakesimko Coalition, Ladies of the Lake. We're all together working on creating this fantastic piece of legislation. It is the best watershed-based legislation in Canada, and it really is the roadmap for how we are to protect Lakesimko. So what I'm doing in the next 3 slides is just pointing out how the Bradford bypass sweeps that all under the rug and almost pretends that the Lakesimko Protection Plan is not there. One of the problems of the Bradford bypass, of course, is that the environmental assessment is more than 20 years old. It predates the Lakesimko Protection Plan. It predates the Greenbelt Plan. It was considered in a different time. And so we're putting the Bradford bypass in the context of today. So here are the objectives of the Lakesimko Protection Act that would be affected by the Bradford bypass. Discharging pollutants to Lakesimko and its tributaries, improving the watershed's ability to adapt to climate change, improving conditions for environmentally sustainable recreation activities. I mean, this bypass would go through a birding hotspot, for example, and it certainly negates the promotion of environmentally sustainable land and water uses and development practices. The Lakesimko Protection Plan was enabled by the Lakesimko Protection Act. And there are principles to guide our actions in it. These are principles that are, well, meant to guide our actions. So the ones that I think are ignored by the Bradford bypass are the precautionary approach, where there's uncertainty about environmental risks, you exercise caution. We know that there are environmental risks and a number of things that have not been studied, which Laura will talk about some more in a few minutes. And we should be using caution, and we're not. The province is proposing not to use caution in going ahead of the Bradford bypass. The second principle is adaptive management approach, which is to continuously improve and adapt our approaches, policies, and management by incorporating new knowledge and innovative design practices and technology from ongoing science and monitoring. Well, I would suggest that a highway proposed more than 20 years ago is not innovative. And does nothing to reflect on what we've learned through adaptive management. And sustainable development, building a highway is not sustainable development. There are other ways to reduce traffic congestion, including finding other routes in the area that can be built upon, maybe that are not going to bisect provincially significant wetland. Lakesimko Protection Plan objectives that are undermined by the Bradford bypass. Now, these are things we're trying to achieve. We're trying to achieve a greater protection of wetlands, but the province seems to be okay with wiping out a good chunk of wetlands for this project, achieving a greater proportion of natural vegetative cover in the watershed, restoring natural areas or features, achieving increased ecological health based on the status of indicator species and natural biodiversity. These are all objectives of the Lakesimko Protection Plan. The Bradford bypass undermines those objectives. There are also other impacts that are not really discussed in the Lakesimko Protection Plan. Those include salt from roads, putting that right beside a wetland and beside 2 rivers would not help. And climate change and the impact on migratory birds, of course, is not considered in this EA. So I'm curious to know, I was curious to know what the government officials were saying about this. This project has been promoted by successive governments and has been promised by successive governments. That is one of the challenges that we have with this particular proposal. There is a lot of pent-up demand, but it doesn't make it right. So Minister of Transportation Carolyn Mulroney, who is the MPP for the area, the entire area affected on the east and the west side of where the bypass would land, she's saying that the Bradford bypass is part of Ontario's COVID recovery. I don't really see how a highway helps us recover from COVID. York Region is saying they anticipate the current environmental assessment process for Bradford bypass will continue to address social, economic, and health issues, as well as necessary public consultations. That's in their staff report. We don't have the same confidence at all. Simcoe County in an email said a number of things, but the one I want to point out is the county has great confidence in the provincial environmental assessment process. Laura Bowman from EcoJustice will talk about that process in a couple minutes. We don't have confidence in that process. And then there are a number of statements that are similar and worrying because we think that they are just wrong. And really, enough is enough. I mean, our elected officials need to make statements that are true and that are in line with the fact that we are in a climate crisis in 2021 with a lake in crisis, and we can't gloss over what we actually know to be true. But Rob Keffer and Virginia Haxon, both mayors in the areas affected at the south end of Lakesimko, they're both standing up for the bypass, confident that the provincial government is undertaking all due diligence, including some 15 environmental studies that are being done to update the EA. The province is trying to get an exemption to those updates, so that's not true. Virginia Haxon from East Gwillimbury says, I'm confident the province will be doing the assessments and studies to make sure that what's going in is less invasive. So I'm just setting Laura up to knock those statements down. Really, you know, it's time that our elected officials make decisions that are in line with the public promises that they have made and our collective need to protect Lakesimko and its health for today and for tomorrow and for all of the wild creatures that also call the Lakesimko watershed home. Thank you.
Thanks, Claire. Before I'll let Laura set up her slides, I feel for you with the Zoom bombing because it happens to me too, having kids. So, but we appreciate it, and I think what we're trying to stress is that we have to start looking at these things from a cumulative impact, and we can't just assume that the Lakesimko Protection Plan does it all. It needs to be supported by a lot of other decisions too. So thank you for pointing that out, Claire. And if you have questions for Claire, please don't forget to put them into the chat because Adam will be going through those once Laura is done. So Laura, I will stop and now it's your turn.
Thanks, Margaret. And thank you, Claire, for that great background on the Lakesimko protection aspects of this. So I've called this presentation, Is This the Best We Can Do? For a reason. And I think it's because as I'll go through, we really have other options to address transportation needs in York Region and Simcoe County, but we just haven't fully explored them. And you'll see that the Bradford bypass has followed a very strange process and continues to follow a very strange process. And that's one of the reasons why we don't have a lot of confidence in the reports that have been done so far and the claims about reports that will be done in the future. So just in terms of where the project is, for those of you who live in the area, it's a little bit north of Queensville Side Road, south of Holborn Road. It's just south of Cook Bay and Lakesimko. The idea of the Bradford bypass is to connect the 400 and the 404 extension. It'll be just north of River Drive Park in Holland Landing, and it will be just south of 9th Line, just north of the built-up area in Bradford. The environmental assessment for the Bradford bypass was completed in 1997, and I just want to let that land for a minute in terms of how long ago this environmental assessment was actually completed. When the environmental assessment was completed, I was 16 years old, and I grew up in that area. So that's how long ago there were public consultations about whether or not the Bradford bypass should happen. And it predates, of course, the Greenbelt Plan, the Lakesimko Protection Plan, and the growth plan for the greater GTA. Now, important things to know about this assessment is that it did not consider any non-highway options to improve the road network. It considered different options, but it didn't look at non-highway road improvements. One of the most alarming things about this assessment is that it concluded that the stormwater runoff from the highway had the potential to severely, these are words right from the EA document, to severely impact the quality and quantity of surface and groundwater south of Lakesimko. And it also talks about how, because it goes through the Holland Marsh and it goes through areas that have very shallow sandy soils and a high groundwater table, that the whole system, not just the groundwater under the highway, but the groundwater system is susceptible to contamination and interference from the highway. There is no climate change assessment as part of the CA. There is no comprehensive assessment of the impact on fish habitat, migratory birds. There's no cumulative effects assessment of the combination of this highway and the 404 extension, or this highway and the sprawl that would go along with the highway. And there is no health impact assessment for noise, vibration, and air quality. There are some very serious natural environment impacts identified in this EA. The highway would have a 100-meter wide right-of-way, go through the Holland Marsh provincially significant wetland complex, and remove a large area of that wetland complex, including areas adjacent to fens and bogs, which are very unusual and difficult to replace. There is a large area of significant woodland. You can see here where the star is at the end of Bathurst Street. It's also an important birding area identified if you go on to eBird. It's a birding hotspot. And these river corridors, the east and west branch of the Holland River going into Cook Bay, are extremely important wildlife movement corridors that would be cut in half by the highway. There's also a number of listed endangered and threatened species that would be impacted, including this bird, the Louisiana water thrush. There's only 500 adults left, and one of the biggest threats to them is stormwater. So obviously this highway is a big concern for them. A number of other listed birds and reptiles are also impacted by the highway. The highway would remove an area that's described in the EA as high quality amphibian habitat. And you can see here just the sheer size and scale of the areas of environmentally significant areas in the Holland Marsh and wildlife habitat that would be impacted by the project. There's also a number of significant archaeological sites along the route, and there's some debate about the exact location of these sites, but one of them is the Lower Landing site, which is a very famous site, and a number of colonial archaeological sites are present, as well as what archaeologists refer to as Paleo-Indian sites, which means they're thousands and thousands of years old. We're talking like 7,000 and 10,000-year-old sites that would be destroyed by the highway. It goes through this pink area, or sorry, this purple area here, which is the Holland Marsh specialty crop area designated in the Greenbelt plan, and you can also see the large areas here of protected countryside in the Greenbelt plan that would be removed. There's a kind of a mythology around this project that everyone wants it, and there is no issue with it. But in fact, at the time when the EA was being done, it was highly controversial. There were local groups in Bradford and in East Gwillimbury who fought it. And it's important to remember that there haven't been public consultations on this project since the 1990s. And that doesn't mean that the issues have gone away or that the opposition has gone away. It just means that people aren't as informed about the project now as they were back then. One interesting thing about the 1997 EA was that one of the reasons it actually was finished was that they got rid of environmental assessment board hearings where you could challenge the evidence in the EA before it was completed. Even with the removal of a public hearing requirement for the EA to get it done, it took 5 years for the EA to be approved because it had a number of important problems that it hadn't addressed, such as the archaeological sites, the stormwater and the groundwater issues, as well as a number of times MTO was the Ministry of Transportation, who was the proponent of the project, was asked to update their noise studies, and nobody was ever satisfied with them. So that was also made a condition of approval. Federal EA was required at that time, and it was until 2012 when federal environmental assessment legislation was changed, but they never went forward with the federal EA process. So what's happened since then? Well, the conditions of approval have not been fulfilled in the decades that have gone by since the EA was finished. They never did the stormwater and the groundwater study. They never did the stage 3 archaeological assessment. They never did the class EA updates to update the transportation studies and the environmental studies. In the mid-2000s, the project was essentially canceled because the growth plan took the province in a different direction, more towards all-day two-way GO service and other solutions. In the meantime, we've had the Greenbelt plan, the Lakesimko protection plan, and other protections put in place for wetlands and other agricultural lands and for Lakesimko. It seemed like this project was dead until in around 2016, the local municipalities lobbied very heavily and very suddenly to have it put back in a revision of the growth plan. And no clear justification was ever put in the growth plan for putting it back in. After 2012, of course, the federal EA requirement disappeared. So those detailed fish and migratory bird impact assessments never happened. And most recently, the Ontario government has proposed an exemption for the project from its 2002 approval conditions, as well as the Class EA requirement. Now, when you see politicians say that there's these 15 studies they're going to do, that's the Class EA requirement that they're proposing an exemption for. Now, that exemption hasn't passed yet, but what they've said is that they don't want to do those studies anymore. So there is no assurance at this time that those studies will ever be completed. The exemption talks about an exemption for early works. And it doesn't exactly explain what those are, but essentially it suggests that they would start building bridges across the east and west branches of the Holland River and other water courses without finishing any of the studies. Because it moves the conditions from an approval to an exemption, it's sort of a technical legal thing, but they're no longer really enforceable. There's no longer legally enforceable requirements for public and Indigenous consultation. And the government would also eliminate the appeal mechanisms that are in the Class EA process that way. They've eliminated some of them last year through Bill 197 for the public. And what's left is Indigenous appeal. That would also be eliminated by moving it to an exemption. No mention of how they would do the federal studies that are still outstanding to get proper permits to do those bridges. Just going back to this early works exemption, I mean, that's really the impetus for us requesting a federal EA. It's not bad enough that the 1997 EA was deficient in a number of significant ways, but they now don't even want to complete the studies they committed to completing under that EA approval. Really, the bottom line is, where is the current information? We're talking about studies that are 2 decades old, and it's one thing to update a few of the impact studies, but do we still need it? Some of the traffic studies are from the 1980s in that EA. They're before upgrades to Highway 9 and Green Lane. Like, Green Lane was a dirt road when I was 16 years old. It was not even the 4-lane road that it is now. We now have all-day two-way GO trains to Barrie, and one of the stated needs for the project really emphasized not traffic jams in Bradford or East Gwillimbury, which were not the significant driver at that time, but commuters from Barrie who needed to get to Toronto or York Region faster. And now we have all-day two-way GO trains that can facilitate some of that commuter traffic. Do we still need it after COVID when many people are working from home? When does the public get to see the Ministry of Transportation's most recent regional traffic assessment, which I tried to FOI and was told I had to pay thousands of dollars to get back in 2016? Where are the regional master plans that explain why we need it? All of these things are missing. So what we would really like is an EA that can have as part of its process looking at other alternatives. How do we provide different access routes to the 400 so that people don't drive through downtown Bradford? Other solutions to some of the intersection problems at places like Green Lane and Yonge Street might be possible. A 4-lane controlled access highway is not the only solution. There are other solutions that need to be looked at. And more importantly, none of the studies that would be done under the Class EA, assuming that it goes ahead, and it may well not, would deal with things like cumulative effects, Indigenous rights, climate change, and Ministry of Transportation has always refused to do health impact studies of its highways. So we're never going to see that unless we get a federal EA. We know that highways are not a solution to traffic congestion if the primary concern is local traffic congestion. It's just a scientific fact that highways cause more congestion. They cause people to drive more kilometers. They cause bottlenecks on local roads at interchanges. And we've seen that if you live in the area, you have already seen that with the 404 extension, with congestion at Ravenshoe Road and places like that. Because it causes people to drive more, there are significant climate change impacts. And in Ontario, our transportation emissions are rapidly growing. We cannot meet our Paris targets if we keep building highways. It's just not possible. And I've included here a title of a paper. They actually call this phenomenon where highways cause people to drive more the fundamental law of road congestion. And I've heard a number of local politicians deny that this is actually a thing. To me, it's like denying that cigarette smoke causes cancer or denying that climate change is real. I mean, there's tons of evidence of this. In terms of cumulative effects, here are all the maps of all the people who own lots of pieces of land along the 404 and the 400 and the proposed Bradford bypass route who would stand to benefit from this highway. And the cumulative effect of both the highway and the salt on the highway and the increase in paved surfaces will increase phosphorus and chloride in Lakesimko and cause major impacts. I just want you to think about these maps here that show people living and working right next to these highways in large numbers when I show you these next slides on air quality. So these are images from Toronto Public Health showing the intense concentrations of nitrogen oxides along highways in Toronto and the very damning benzene figures for Highway 401. It's also particulate matter is a huge concern. Because you're putting all the cars in one place, you're concentrating the pollution all in one place, and you're causing a very, 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 very serious health impact issue. It's really no joke, and the evidence is increasing day by day of, it causes deficient lung development in children. It can cause Alzheimer's, heart disease. There was a huge drop in preterm births and low birth weight births during the COVID lockdown across the world because people were being exposed to less air pollution from cars. It's a major contributor to preterm births and low birth weights, lung disease, and it also can exacerbate COVID-19 outcomes. And we've also been to this movie before in the region with refusal of Ministry of Transportation to do proper noise studies with the 404 extension, an issue that I raised on behalf of a Smart Growth, Ontario Smart Growth Network at that time. Our request for them to do better noise studies was denied, and sure enough, the highway opened and it was too loud and people were extremely upset. So if you live in this area, this is what you have to look forward to. Really the only solution is a federal EA. This province has recently gutted environmental assessment across the board. They clearly have no intention of properly assessing this highway. The Ministry of Transportation has a history of denying health impacts, regional air quality impacts, climate impacts, you name it. They don't believe in the fundamental scientific issues that are involved in building a highway. And the province has a history of not forcing them to do those studies properly. So what we've done is we've requested that the federal government designate it under the Federal Impact Assessment Act so that it can get a federal assessment, which is overseen by an independent impact assessment agency. And the possible outcome is the Federal Minister of Environment can refuse to issue federal permits, which are required for the crossings on the rivers and any rail crossings or anything like that that the federal government has approval authority for, and they can require cumulative effects assessment and proper studies of the impacts on Lakesimko. And I get this question a lot. Yes, they do have authority, constitutional authority to review the impacts of highways. So it's really important that you support this request. The minister is going to make a decision by early April. You do need to, if you want to participate, comment. You can comment with the Impact Assessment Agency on their website directly about the Bradford bypass. You can also sign Environmental Defense's petition, and I believe that Simcoe County Greenbelt Coalition is also sharing the link. Even if you are with an organization who has already supported our letter, I think it's really key that you get in touch with your local council and do some deputations, educate them about the risks of this project for Lakesimko, and also, individually call and write in with your members and supporters to support the federal EA. One of the biggest considerations for the federal government is public concern, and unfortunately, unlike GTA West, where there's been a lot of public consultations and people are generally more aware of what the impacts are, in the case of Bradford bypass, those public consultations haven't happened yet, and so we're at a little bit of disadvantage in terms of people being aware of the problems. So please write to your MP, write to Minister Wilkinson, and educate your local council about why they should support our request, because they're all being asked by the impact agency what they think. York Region is going to make a decision this week, so please, if you live in York Region, please, please, please write to them and tell them that you want them to support this. And that's it.
All right, thank you, Laura. We're going to open up for questions now, and Adam will be putting in some links to actions that Laura mentioned, and as I said before, we'll be doing a follow-up email that has these links. And it is concerning, Laura, when you mentioned about the climate impacts. Mayor Keffer wrote a letter to the province stating that this highway would reduce congestion and reduce greenhouse gas emissions, and I just went, what? If these are the frame that people are making these types of decisions on, that's directly counter to the science and evidence, then this is not good. And I know that maybe our mythology within our broader society is that highways and infrastructure are just necessary and they're always a benefit, which I think goes back to how little oversight and study they have to have in order to be seen as valuable. So I hope people here can start to appreciate that if we, as Laura said, if we have any chance of mitigating or adapting to climate, meeting our targets, highways just are a non-starter. They really are not something that we should be willy-nilly just adding all the time, because like she said, the sprawl, everything else. So I think if there's one thing you get from this, other than let's take action and help stop this or get the federal EA to weigh in, is that we can no longer accept that highways are just a net benefit. They just simply aren't. So we have a few questions, and keep adding them into the chat, and we're going to try and go through as many as we can. If it's going well, we might go as late as 8:15, but we're hoping to be done roughly around 8. So first question, I believe this will be for you, Laura, and I know that there's some exemptions that are related to this. Will people's homes be expropriated?
Yes, so under Bill 197, the province passed, and this was back in July, the province passed a bunch of changes to expropriations law in Ontario that makes it easier for them to take your home for a highway, specifically for the major highways in the GTA that they are looking at doing, and this one would be included in that. So there would no longer be a proper expropriation hearing to determine if the project is necessary. And this is something that's been around as a civil justice reform since the 70s. So they're going back to the 70s in terms of expropriation process, specifically for this highway. And I think what it goes to show is that they cannot justify that they need this highway, and so they're getting rid of all of the processes that are in place that would require them to do that. And one of those is an expropriation process. So yes, they can take your home, and they can take it without a hearing now. Just special for this highway and other highways that the province wants to move faster with. They also did that for a number of transit projects in Toronto. And some of those people are also requesting a federal EA because they're upset about that.
Okay. I'm assuming we don't know how many homes could potentially be expropriated?
No, I mean, I don't have a hard number on that, but if you're along the route, you should definitely be concerned.
Okay, thank you. Laura, do you mind just stopping your screen share? We're just going to put, just so Adam can share some things if he has to, sorry. Okay, this is for maybe Claire and Laura. What position has the Lakesimko Region Conservation Authority taken on the Bradford bypass, or have they taken a position?
Well, of course, there haven't been public consultations or agency consultations since the 1990s. So the most recent position I have from them is back then, and they wanted wetland replacement for all of the pieces of wetland and woodlands that were going to be removed by the project, and the Ministry of Transportation refused to provide that.
Okay. And just to make a note on relating to some broader topics, the province has announced a wetland offsetting regime that would make it easier to replace wetlands for cost. So that also factors into the broader picture. Claire, did you have anything on this, or do you want to move to the next question? Okay. All right, well, here's another one. I think I know the answer for this, but I'll open up to you guys anyways. Why isn't the Holland Marsh legislatively protected from development? It is prime agricultural land.
You know, there are some protections in the Greenbelt Plan. Unfortunately, none of those protections can be applied or enforced against a highway. Highways get special treatment under pretty much every piece of environmental or agricultural protection legislation.
Okay, Claire, did you have anything to add to that?
No, but I can address the Holland Marsh question.
Mm-hmm.
I was in the room making a delegation to King, and you know, it was somebody put in the chat, they were asking about why is it called the Holland Marsh Highway. So let me just clarify. If you Google Holland Marsh, the whole area, all the way up to Lakesimko, that actually is all connected. It is all one ecosystem. It's all one connected wetland. It's all called the Holland Marsh. It's kind of like, so the northern end of it is known locally, and I mean, I only learned about this a year ago, that the northern end is called the Keswick Marsh, but it's part of the Holland Marsh. So it's not going through the agricultural part of the Holland Marsh that people drive through on Highway 400. It's north of that, but it's part of the Holland Marsh.
Right.
I wanted to address that. We're
Yes.
hearing a lot of flack about that. We just kept calling it the Bradford bypass here.
Yes, and that's fine. And I think the one thing I'd like to say about that is that if the major concern is what we're calling the highway and not the cumulative impacts of the highway, then that is concerning. If that is how people want to argue about it, that, oh, it's not actually technically that, and use it as a way to deflect from what are the impacts, is this necessary, what is the price even of this highway, then I think for me, that's also a non-starter, because I'm not willing to debate semantics when it comes to our water, the health of our communities, and the future production of our foodlands. So I appreciate that there's some people locally that want to make it very clear, but I would also like to make it very clear that this issue is bigger than what we're calling it, right? So, sorry, I got a little fired up there because it bothers me a lot. Okay, so how will Scanlon Creek Conservation Area be affected? This is a very important space for our local community.
The route doesn't go through Scanlon Creek, but the Scanlon Creek is part of a bigger wildlife corridor that would be cut in half by this. And of course, there would be the air pollution, the regional air quality reductions would also impact Scanlon Creek, and because it's part of that adjacent Nottawasaga watershed, there's also the potential for the chloride and the salt to impact the waterways through Scanlon Creek.
Okay. Claire, did you have something? I saw you moving, so I'm trying to, okay.
Looking at a map, it's okay.
So next is about kind of like highways. As we mentioned, the highway goes just north of Bradford, and the idea is let's get traffic out of downtown, and you know, there's been local media covering about how there's a revitalization of Bradford's downtown, and once the highway gets built, then we can revitalize it. But the question is, should we be concerned about the effects of the highway, that the highway will have on the businesses in downtown? And I can add comment to that later, but open it up to you too.
Okay, well, why don't I speak, because Laura's been answering all the technical questions. Yeah, I mean, I think everybody has this experience. You take the highway, you don't go up Ravenshoe Road anymore, you know, you go up the 404. So what about the little antique shops on Ravenshoe Road and all the, you know, little the stores along the way and the garden centers and all that? They just get bypassed. That's a bypass. The bypass goes past. So it's not going to help the downtown. It would reduce some traffic congestion, but I think one of the points that we're trying to make here is that there are lots of other alternatives that should be considered that don't gut wetlands and kill migratory birds. You know, and I think we're at a stage where we should be thinking about that. So sure, let's fix the traffic snarl, you know, but we don't need to gut Bradford on the way. You know, people stop at the home hardware, people stop at fast food places. There are really good restaurants in downtown Bradford that sort of go beyond what you think a town of that size might have. And I think it's because they get a lot of traffic going through there. So, you know, I'm not saying that they should always have lots of traffic going through there, but there are upsides to people driving through town, and that the highway does not the highway has not really saved any towns. Challenge someone to give an example.
Mm-hmm. Laura, did you want to add to that?
Yes, I mean, we saw what happened when the 404 extension went in, and people stopped taking Leslie Street and Woodbine and Highway 48. Those businesses took a hit. People weren't stopping at them on their way home anymore, and Bradford's going to have that same experience. Now, I just want to acknowledge that, you know, nobody's saying we want diesel trucks barreling through downtown Bradford. That's not a good thing either. But the solution is to look at trying to distribute the traffic over the regional road network around downtown Bradford and give them other access points to the 400 if that's where they're trying to go. Mm-hmm. You don't need to build a 4-lane controlled access, multi-billion-dollar highway through the Holland Marsh to get that outcome.
Absolutely. And I think too, you know, lots of communities have gone through this exercise and the same results. The highway brings the houses, which brings the investments around the highway and drains the resources that would be put into downtown. So with this particular one, DG Group owns several plots of employment land that they have put in their proposal that, well, actually what we're planning on doing is making it into houses. So, you know, this isn't just a highway to connect employment lands. A lot of those employment lands are pretty empty. What's going to happen, and traditionally it happens, and Laura and Claire and Adam, we all see it happen. It starts off with employment lands, and then it's all of a sudden like, oops, the employment isn't coming. What if we just convert it to houses instead? So my personal opinion is that what will happen is the highway will come. If the highway comes, the houses shortly thereafter, the municipality is using those to provide big box stores and all kinds of things to help the people in the suburbs to avoid the downtown because they don't want to go through the traffic of it all. So you really start to distribute and spread the jam pretty thin about where money is going to be spent. And you can look at Barrie's downtown as another example. You know, people don't have to go down there. They can take the 400 and, you know, they can get around the downtown, and they're now, Barrie is trying to make it a thing where they're forcing people back down there, right? So this is something that's been tried and tested, and I wouldn't expect different results with this highway. Okay, what about impacts to air quality locally? I've heard concerns about particulates and car emissions and the impacts on health, especially for children. I think you touched on this, Laura, but I think they want a little bit more information, perhaps.
Yes, there's very strong evidence that children who live within about 100 meters of a highway, they have, their lungs actually don't develop properly. It's not just that you know, the stuff gets in and they get lung disease. Their lungs actually develop in an improper way, which impacts them for the rest of their lives. And I just want to pause and say, just going back to your point, Margaret, about employment lands and residential housing potentially being put right next to these highways. I mean, it should not be legal. I mean, if you look at those air quality maps I showed, it's too dangerous to be next to a highway all the time if you're there 8 hours a day working 5 days a week, or if you're sleeping there at night. Nobody should be existing all the time next to a highway, which is a major, major pollution source like that. So it seems, from a public health perspective, it seems unconscionable to me that you would put anything next to a highway, given what we know about the benzene levels and the nitrogen oxide and the particulate matter, the cumulative effect of which is very severe on people's health. And you know, it's not just limited to lungs. It's heart disease, it's Alzheimer's, there's cognitive impairments, which are known to be caused by air pollution from cars when it's highly concentrated in an area like a highway. And one of the most egregious things is that MTO refuses to do health impact studies. What they do is they look at the provincial air quality guidelines and whether or not they would be met. But you know, first of all, it's based on modeling. So they guess how many trucks there will be, they guess how many cars there will be, what kind of, you know, pollution those cars will be releasing, and so on. The air quality guidelines that we have in Ontario are extremely deficient. And when the Bradford bypass EA was first done, Health Canada says you shouldn't even use these guidelines. Like, we know the science, and this is the 1997 science, which has evolved quite a bit since then, we know these guidelines don't reflect when a health impact happens, that health impacts happen from nitrogen oxides at way lower levels, from particulate matter at way lower levels than these guidelines. And MTO said that's not our problem. We're not assessing anything in relation to health impacts. We're only going to assess against the guidelines. And most of those guidelines haven't changed except for benzene. And I did compare the current benzene standards, which would be exceeded even under not even the highest level of truck traffic that they modeled. And benzene is a very potent carcinogen. So it's a real concern, and you should be very concerned if you're within like 100 or 200 meters of this possible route. There shouldn't be schools there, there shouldn't be people working there, there shouldn't be people living there, period.
All right. Yeah, no, it's unbelievable to me there. Sorry, I got caught doing double duty. I have a specific question about the federal assessment and what it could reveal. And I know, Claire, that you expressed concerns about the impacts to Lakesimko. So I'm wondering if, Claire, what would you hope to get out of a federal assessment for Lakesimko? And Laura, what would you hope that a federal assessment would reveal, or what kind of questions they could answer?
I think, I mean, my understanding of the process is that, the federal EA can at least start with looking at the areas of federal jurisdiction, which are fisheries and migratory birds. We have international agreements we're supposed to honor, and climate change, which, as Laura detailed, wasn't included in the 1997 EA here. But really, it's kind of, let's push pause and think about all the things that we've talked about here and come up with a better solution for a traffic jam.
For sure. Laura, did you have anything about what you would like to see come out of it?
Yes, I mean, federal EA is a much more independent and rigorous process than provincial EA in general, and I'm talking before the environmental rollbacks of the current government. The Impact Assessment Agency of Canada is an independent agency with a high level of expertise in assessing environmental effects. They do require cumulative effects to be assessed. I mean, you can't get away with not assessing cumulative effects in a federal EA. That includes health impacts. So what I'm really hoping to see is, first of all, ensuring that those groundwater and stormwater studies are done and that the actual effect on the aquatic and terrestrial environment of that contamination, as well as on agriculture, because if you're talking chloride contamination and groundwater that's used in the Holland Marsh, that question hasn't been answered either. So I'm really hoping to see that stormwater and groundwater stuff get done properly with proper oversight, cumulative effects, climate change, and also the health impact studies that Health Canada asked to be done. With some federal oversight, we might get some teeth into those requests. Perfect.
I'm gonna just, so it's getting close to 8, and I've asked the panelists ahead of time if they'd be okay to go to 8:15 as our hard stop time. There are lots of questions. We will get through as many as we can until 8:15, and then whatever is left over, we'll work with the panelists to answer the ones that are unanswered and send it out in our follow-up email. So as long as you've registered, you will get an email in the coming days with the video and with any unanswered questions and all of the good links that we tried to share tonight. Claire, I was wondering if you could put up the map, speaking of alternatives and that sort of thing. We haven't really discussed what are the alternatives other than talking about it broadly. And I don't know if that's something that Claire wants to discuss or Laura, because how this project is framed is it's a false dichotomy. Either we do this highway or we're going to have traffic through Bradford forever and it's really bad. So I think it's important to recognize that there are alternatives to this that aren't as harmful, that do put more investment into the community. And I just we're not traffic engineers, but based on some studies that have been done, there are some alternatives that should at least be examined. Who would like to take that, Claire or Laura? Laura?
Sure. So, I mean, this is just a bit of a riff on the regional road network. So we know that, for example, it's, you know, around the area where it says Bradford, West Gwillimbury, that we get the most traffic congestion. And one of the reasons for that is that there are discontinuities in the road network, both north and south of Bradford. There are no interchanges. There's already a ring road just where the W is. It starts, it goes north, it goes up, but then there's no interchange access at the 400 there. So you can't actually take that to get to the 400 and get away from the traffic. Similarly to the south, we all know the Canal Road interchange is not the best interchange, and it's a very tiny little road that could be upgraded a little bit, make it a bit safer. Where there's already an interchange, allow people to access it from other directions, which currently there are no bridges over some of these creeks down to the south in Andersbelt. There's also opportunities, you know, to make it more continuous with Green Line, to provide better access to 400 and Highway 9. So without examining these alternatives in a thorough way, which hasn't been done, I think it's not fair to assert that this highway is the only way to keep trucks out of downtown Bradford. And we need an assessment process that will look at these alternatives more seriously and look at these alternatives in a way that is fair-minded and independent.
Thanks, Laura. And just to ask a clarification about that, we have a couple of questions about this highway. Is it going to go just between 400 and 404? Is it possible it could be extended to Highway 50 and go up to Collingwood? Some people are wondering if it can be extended to Fifth Side Road. Do we know if it's a hard stop for now, or are there kind of conversations that, yes, this is the first phase and maybe down the road we'll extend it?
I've never heard of any proposal to extend it beyond the 400. That doesn't mean that couldn't happen in the future, but I've never heard of any proposal like that. Okay.
Okay, so Claire, this one's kind of for you. It sort of relates to Innisfil and Bradford together. It talks about Innisfil chose to seek an MZO for the Orbit development because they couldn't get provincial funding for a GO transit station. I don't think it's that they couldn't get provincial funding. I think that the province kind of changed the rules there. So I think there's a little bit that has to be clarified in that. And they want the cost borne by the developer. So why is there provincial money for this highway, but there's no money for a GO train station? Like, what does this say? I guess the broader question is, what does this say about the priorities that the provincial government has right now?
Okay, I'm so excited to answer that question. So, I mean, follow the money. Who makes money with any of these decisions, right? Every time you build a road that opens up a new area for sprawl, the people who own the land there, or any development, it could be dense development, the people who own the land there are going to make money. And what we're seeing, and it reported daily in the news, is that there's an extremely close relationship between the development community and the government of Ontario right now, and probably just specific individuals within the government of Ontario. So I think that's kind of the answer. I mean, in Innisfil, what's happened with that minister's zoning order request, it's not been granted yet, we're still trying to stop that, is that the province changed the rules and they said, okay, we're not going to fund the building of GO train stations. We're going to let developers do that. Sounds good, but then they pass another piece of legislation that actually makes sure that public dollars can be used to back these risks taken by developers. Yeah, so it's not that there's no money to build GO train stations. You can get them built for $12 to $20 million. It's not that hard or complicated. There's a formula. It's that you can build, I mean, the mayor of Innisfil is talking a lot about how fabulous a GO train station could be in Innisfil. And this is a town that has never done a single thing that looks like they care about urban design. And now they want, you know, the most beautiful GO train station on the line. I think that particular game is a play to get enough land for the developer around the orbit or the developers around the orbit to be able to make a lot of money. And so the province and the developers seem to be playing a game where, you know, they make the rules so that development can proceed. Developing is the COVID recovery plan, which I find worrying. So I don't think it's a matter of there not being money. I think it's government of Ontario would frame it differently. They're accessing developer money, but I don't think that this should be just a no strings attached kind of arrangement that we have here. I mean, yeah, they're planning on spending a lot of money on a highway that we are debating, not necessarily that there's no need to change something about the traffic or something about alternative routes here, but the province is definitely willing to spend their own money on a highway here. Anyway, I think it's a really good question. I think I've said enough about that. Just follow the money. Who wins?
Which actually brings me to a good point, because a lot of people have, there's a couple people that have asked, you know, what is the cost of this? And I was trying to find an up-to-date cost, you know, estimate. And the earliest that I could find, or the most recent I could find, was something like 12 years ago. And it was pegged at just like 725 million or something. But I couldn't find anything recently in the budgets, in the press releases. There's nothing. So, I mean, that's a problem for me. We don't even know how much we're spending. We know that the 413 is roughly 6 to 10 billion, depending on, you know, if you're looking at the old estimate or what it would probably be now. But I have no, you know, this is the kind of craziness of it all, is we are willing to build a highway without actually telling the public, just so you know, we're going to be spending a billion, roughly, let's just estimate it, roughly $1 billion. We're not going to do the health impact assessments. We're not going to make sure that the environmental processes are through. And you guys are just going to have to accept it, because highways are good and we know what we're doing. So Laura, do you know any more than I know regarding the cost?
Well, there's also no benefit analysis, right? Because we don't have that most recent MTO regional assessment, and we don't have what we have for GTA West, which is an expert panel assessment that actually tried to calculate like how much commuting time would be saved. And often what you find with these highways, and then the data is similar for things like the Gardner Expressway and the GTA West Highway, which is a 50-kilometer highway that also goes through a lot of green space. Yes, the estimates of actual improvements in commuter time are marginal. There are things like 60 to 80 seconds, or you know, in that range, and those are just at peak times, and at other times there's no effect. So you know, you have to think also about what is the benefit you're getting for that expense and those impacts, and we don't have that answer. I'd love it if someone could give me an answer of how much commute time would be saved by this. My guess is it's similar to other highway proposals that have happened in the last 10 years, which is we're looking at, we spend a lot of money, we get huge health and other impacts, and a few people at rush hour save a minute or two in commute times, and that's going to be the reality here.
Thanks, Laura. Something else a little bit more technical was about how far back from a residential street are they legally allowed to construct the bypass? I guess that would be your setbacks potentially.
You can put residential developments right next to a highway. I mean, you saw that picture of the woman looking through the chain link fence that was at the 404 extension. That was her backyard. I mean, there are no legally required setbacks. They can put the highway right next to your window.
Right. So pretty close. Claire, you're someone who has a love for wetlands, and you know a lot about the ecology around Lake Simcoe. There was a question about, and I think it's a little bit rhetorical, tongue in cheek, but you know, how can you replace the features and functions of a wetland or woodland, which would be beyond the time frame for mitigating just the climate change impacts? Like when you're removing these things, how can we possibly replace them with new woodlands and wetlands? And I know that's a part of the issue with the Lakes and Protection Plan, is that there's no real implementation to ensure that these places are kept and preserved, right? So how are we supposed to just replace wetlands willy-nilly?
It doesn't work. The wetland is where it needs to be. They're not put there by road engineers. It's not like something you can pick off the shelf and put somewhere else. I mean, they perform a function on the landscape where they're found. So there have been some studies into the efficacy of these offsetting regimes the province of Ontario is advancing. The only way that it can work is if you get a ton of money from destroying a wetland somewhere and you were able to build something way bigger, but like right beside it. I mean, the wetland function, it filters contaminants out of the water. And if you've lost that function where you have water and contaminants flowing, then what's going to do that job for you? Like, you know, Joe's basement. So yeah, I mean, there are a lot of problems with destroying wetlands, and one of them is, you know, my husband and I were he works on climate change, and we're like, I wonder if we have the kind of insurance that would protect our house from floods, and we didn't, so we got it. It's an extra $160 a year or something like that. Not everybody has that kind of flood protection, so it's not just removing wetlands and replacing them somewhere else doesn't work. It's also that removing the wetlands also has really big impacts on people who are downstream, who are homeowners. And I mean, in this case, it's the rest of the wetland, and it is the water quality that would suffer.
Yeah. And also to keep in mind that there are homeowners within Toronto and other regions that cannot get flood insurance, right? That is something that happens, and the insurance companies have been saying, just so you know, we may not be offering this much to people. So as things continue. So we have time for 2 more questions, and then I think we've answered most of them, but there's 2 specific ones. As far as the 413, which is the larger of the 2 evils, as far as more notoriety, but not necessarily more valid. It goes through a lot of the greenbelt. And do we know the percentage of the Bradford bypass, how much is within the greenbelt? It's a much shorter route than the 413. Laura, do you know by chance? You're still, there you go.
Yeah, if you want us to bring up a map again, we can do that.
If you don't have it to hand, Laura, we can do a different question and we can answer it in a follow-up if you want, so that we can accurate percentage.
Yeah, I'm gonna. Oh.
And you're still on mute, Laura, just so you know.
All right, sorry about that. So this map shows the protected countryside greenbelt area, and I'll just get rid of my camera stuff. You can see that it starts, like the highway route is approximately here. So this is all that green is greenbelt protected countryside, and the purple is Holland Marsh specialty crop area. Just to, again, for the Holland Marsh label deniers, this is a map from the Greenbelt Plan, which calls it the Holland Marsh specialty crop area, which is protected under the Greenbelt Plan, but not from highways. So I don't have a percentage, but you can kind of get a visual sense of the, I mean, a good chunk of the route is, until you get to Bradford, is greenbelt.
Perfect. And then the last one is the timeline. You know, if the federal government's going to be making a decision about whether they're going to do an EA, I think early May, if that's my understanding. What could happen if the federal EA does go through? If it doesn't go through, what timelines are we potentially looking at? I know that might be hard to guess because you're not the one making the decisions, Laura, but do you have any sense of timing at all?
The Federal Minister of Environment has to make a decision by May about whether or not to designate it for a federal EA. The EA will, it does follow certain mandated timelines, so it shouldn't take that long, but of course that assumes that Ministry of Transportation actually does the studies in a timely way. And to be blunt, it is an open question whether or not the Ministry of Transportation can pass a federal EA. I mean, they'd have to do stuff they've never done before, like health impact assessments and climate change assessments. So it could take a while for them to get their act together and actually do some of those studies if it is designated. but I don't, I can't say an exact timeline. That the legislative timelines can be paused when the proponent doesn't provide adequate studies.
Okay. What if the federal EA doesn't go through? Do we have a timeline if they decide not to?
It's really unclear right now because we have this proposed exemption that purports to allow them to start building bridges tomorrow. If that exemption passes, or some of the changes to the EA law that were enacted last year are put in force, you could see approvals happening very, very quickly. I mean, it's hard to speculate, but this government seems to, in Ford's words from just yesterday, talking about another one of my wetland protection files, why is it so hard to get these permits? It should be blim, blam, bloom, rock and roll. So that's the attitude of this government. I would expect if that exemption went through, you could see shovels in the ground very quickly, although of course they still don't have their federal Fisheries Act permits, so that might slow them down just a little bit.
Perfect. All right, so we're going to stop. I think we've answered most of the questions. If there was a question that you have burning, please put it into the chat and we will make sure that the panelists provide an answer. So I'm sorry if you had a question that we didn't get to. I think we've covered most of them. I hate to end meetings on this is really terrible and there's nothing we can do. We can see the pushback that has happened with the 413, where the province was like, this is going through, we're going to stick with it. And then you get MPP Calandra who said, if the people don't want it, it's a bad idea, then we're willing to say we're not going to do it. Unfortunately, the Bradford bypass hasn't got as much public notoriety, and frankly a lot of the local councillors and councils are very much in support of this, both within Bradford West Gwillimbury and York Region and Simcoe County. So what I would suggest is if this presentation tonight has compelled you to get involved, that doesn't mean you have to go pick it tomorrow, although you're more than welcome to. But it does mean to just step up a little bit. Maybe send in a letter to your local paper, right? Write a letter to your MPP, write a letter to your councillor, and send it to the media too, because that's what actually turns the dial on some of these things, is that when the politicians feel that the heat is on, they can easily just delete voicemails and they can easily ignore forum letters. But really the media and those public, or sorry, the personalized contact with your decision makers makes a difference, especially the public component to it. So I ask you all to go through the chat, maybe click on some of those actions, see what you can do. Most importantly, see if this bothers you, talk to 10 people in your network to say, hey, I just got this video about the Bradford bypass. Did you know? Because what we do know is that behavior and perspectives change the more that the person who talks to you about this issue is a trusted friend or relative or whatever else. So I could talk to 50 people, and if people trust me, that'll make a difference. But if it's just a bunch of strangers, not as effective. So use your network. Don't feel afraid to contact them and let them know all of the things that are happening. And I think as Claire and Laura have so eloquently pointed out, the Bradford bypass should not just be yep, it's all good, we've done everything we need to. There's a lot of mythology around this, and clearly significant impacts to our communities from an ecology, from Lakesimko, human health, economic. So if we're going to wrap up, thank you to Laura and to Claire. If you would like to save the chat, just in case there was links in there that you would like to save tonight, if you go into the chat feature and you see on the bottom right, there's 3 dots, you can click on that and it says save chat. But we will also be sending it out to everybody too. And like I said, we'll be sending out the webinar recording and all of the links. York Region is meeting tomorrow. Is that correct? Head nods, Claire?
Yes.
And Laura, yes?
This is by noon tomorrow. If you were going to send a letter to York Region, you send it to clerk general line at york.ca.
Right.
General line at york.ca by noon tomorrow. And you do not need to be an expert. Just write a letter saying, there are too many questions. I don't want to hurt Lakesimko. I don't like climate change. Like, whatever. Just write them a letter.
Absolutely. And I think that's one thing I just leave the final point is that it doesn't take a technical expert to have an opinion. They want to know that you care. And so even if it's 2 sentences, I know about the Bradford bypass, I'm against it, I want you to do something about it. It is not your job to do their job for them and provide them with technical expertise and alternatives and here's all the research you need to know. You're more than welcome to do that. But the most important thing is that you have agency. You're a part of a democracy. This is the work of democracy that gets us the decisions that we want. So feel free to recognize that you have agency and you don't have to support your things with lots of research. Just saying, I don't like it and you need to do something about it is more than enough. And it will, if a lot of people do that, we'll get some action. Anyways, thank you, everybody. I hope you found it helpful, and I thank you for coming and caring, and please let's get this issue more highlighted. Thank you to my panels. Thank you to Adam for the behind the scenes stuff, and thanks for sharing your evening with us. Good night, everybody.